had this long interview with a guy saying, well, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm a bass player. I'm trying to study. And he said, well, are you a good bass player or a bad bass player? And I said, well, I'm trying to be a good bass player. That's why I'm coming. He said, well, I hope so, because we sure need them.
I knew from the moment I met today's guest that we were going to have a great conversation for the podcast, and that certainly happened. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are talking today with Steve Reeves, who recently retired after 30 years as principal bassist of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. This just happened to coincide with my trip to Australia, so Steve and I sat down for a coffee and to talk. His career, all the various twists and turns, if you want, it's a very instructive path, and I'll let Steve describe that. But we also talk about why he decided to retire, what's happening next for him, what he's learned after all these decades being a principal player, the highs, the lows. They are all very entertaining and insightful. And I just had a great time chatting with Steve. I know you're going to love today's conversation. And a quick shout out to our sponsors: Steve Swan String Bass, Upton Bass, Dario Strings, the Bass Violin Shop, Modacity, Colstein Music, and A440 Violin Shop. More on them later after we dig into today's chat with the wonderful Steve Reeves. Steve and I are sitting at a coffee shop here in Melbourne on Gertrude Street.
Hipster Central.
It feels like Hipster Central.
Yeah.
And we've now pulled out microphones and people have been looking at us in the windows we've been walking by, so we might get more looks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's utterly comfortable in every way.
And we met in person for the first time last night
yep.
at Ben Puglisi's shop.
Yep.
And Ben told me, I got together with him a few days ago, that you had just retired.
That's true.
From the orchestra, principal bass, for how many years?
31.
31 years.
Yeah.
And you just told me you had a 3 to 4 hour daily commute each way.
Yeah.
So I guess my first question is, what are you going to do with all that found time?
Very good question. I think the first thing is detox.
Okay.
And yeah, look, it's a very strange feeling. I don't feel like I've retired yet because, it's a few weeks ago, and I've been playing since I had a gig last week, and then I've got the bass day tomorrow. So after tomorrow, it's going to be a very strange feeling. Very, very strange feeling. But yeah, it's definitely time.
Yeah.
There comes a time when it's time. I wanted to get out while I still felt I could play. Mm-hmm. And I still love the bass. I love playing the bass. I love my bass. But I figure I've been in the orchestra half my life, and that gives me about a third to go. And it'll either involve music or it won't, in some capacity. I don't know, but that's okay. I've been a bass player, earning a living for over 40 years, and we'll just see. It's a big world out there.
Well, I'm planning on coming back next year and bringing my wife, so we'll have to do a round 2 podcast, and we'll find out what you...
Absolutely.
So maybe we can rewind.
Yeah.
How'd you get into music?
Musical family. My father was a clarinetist, and he was a wonderful musician, and he actually, funnily enough, at one point he was even principal of the same orchestra that I'm in now.
Wow.
Or I have been in. But he only lasted a couple of years there. But he, so there was always music in our family. My brother's also a musician. And I never decided to become a musician. It just kind of happened. But I played violin as a kid. It was pretty bad. Then I played trumpet, and I was even worse. But around that time, I started to like bass sounds, and played electric bass, played in several bands, very badly, but God, it was fun. And We have national music camps here, which have been going for, 50, 60 years or so. And my father taught at a lot of them. And so I was a staff kid at all these camps, and it was always great fun. But I heard a bass player play, John Mosen, who actually at the time was principal in Melbourne. And I heard him play the Eccles Sonata.
Oh, yeah?
And I'd never heard anything like it. And that was it. I was actually at the camp playing trumpet. And I thought, I want to do this. And yeah, here we are.
When did, so we were just talking before we press record here about studying in the States, and I know that you studied with Gary Carr at a certain point. Like, go through maybe your training. Did you do your own? Yeah.
It was eclectic. I started in Adelaide. We were living in Adelaide. And the principal of the Adelaide Symphony was a guy called John Foster, who was not a great bass player, but he was a wonderful musician. And I had irregular lessons with him. He was a very thirsty man. So lessons often got cancelled.
Got it.
But he taught me to love the bass and its role, and the concept of playing musically with everything that you do. So music was at the forefront of everything he thought. And even though he didn't teach me how to play the bass, he put me on a musical path that I will forever be grateful for. Then a couple of years later, we moved to Sydney, and I, again, it was a weird time, but I had lessons with Max Claxton, who is one of the nicest people ever to play the bass. But he was in the Sydney Symphony, and they were doing a lot of touring that year, so I didn't get a lot of lessons. But I studied with him. I studied with Dave Ellis, who you'll also meet, who again was just a wonderful man and a bigger influence on me than he actually realizes, and just a hell of a nice guy. So anyway, but I couldn't really play it in those days. I mean, in fact, I couldn't play at all. But I in those days also, if you could hold a bass, you could work. So after I finished school, I just started getting jobs. And I was also, at the Sydney Con at the time, there was a man called Robert Pickler, who was an extraordinary musician. In fact, still the best musician I've ever come across, without question. I think pretty much everybody who worked with him, he had a chamber orchestra that he directed. And I think pretty much everybody in that orchestra would say the same thing, that they've never come across a musician of that quality ever before or since. So I was very lucky to be in that group for a year or two. And then I just started getting work. And so I was incredibly lucky. I got to... my first gig ever was with the London Festival Ballet.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and Nureyev was dancing, and it was an extraordinary introduction to professional music and to ballet. I've always loved playing ballet since. And yeah, so I just had an incredibly lucky set of experiences. And so I basically started working. So I had lessons for a couple of years, and then was in the right place at the right time to work. But I still couldn't play. And then I went overseas for a while, just traveling. So yeah, I just traveled around, and I'd heard of a guy in Holland, the guy called Anthony Woodrow, who was he'd been the principal bass in Rotterdam and principal of the orchestra of the 18th century.
Oh, okay, cool.
And I, at the end of my travels, which was about 8 months, I found myself in Holland, and I went to meet him and asked him if I could study with him. And so I played to him a little bit, and he said, yeah, okay. So I went went home with a view of coming back to Holland to study when I could. Around that time, my father did a music camp in Hong Kong, and Gary was teaching there.
Nice.
And being my father, he spoke to Gary about me, and Gary said, well, send him along to my summer school, which at the time was Shawnigan Summer School, which morphed into Car Camp later.
Sure.
So I'd arranged to go to Holland and study with Anthony, but on my way I went to Victoria, BC, and spent 6 weeks with Gary. Changed my life. Completely changed my life.
So I've had Gary on the podcast a couple times.
Yeah.
About a year ago, I had the good fortune to spend a week with Gary and just kind of hang out with Gary. He was at Andres Martin's camp, who we just saw last night.
Yeah.
So, and he's changed. I mean, like so many bass players,
Yeah.
the reason I play bass is because I saw Gary play in my hometown live. So, but maybe what was that experience like working with Gary? What was Car Camp like?
Oh, look, it was transformative. I mean, I literally couldn't play. I couldn't play for shit when I went there. And Gary, it's really hard to describe the influence Gary had. He let me know that it was possible. That what I wanted was possible. It was possible for me, which I never believed really. And he taught me how to make a sound, taught me how to practice, and set me on a path that, if I can play the bass today, it's because of Gary. End of story. Just the most profound influence in every way. Just, fantastic, wonderful, owe him everything. And I ended up, after the camp, I went to Holland and studied with Anthony, but my head was in a different place. So I lasted a semester, and Gary was doing a recital in London. So I went to see him to ask him if I could go and study with him. And, oh God, the experiences you have. While I was in Holland, I was working illegally in an orchestra that's now defunct in Utrecht. I was lucky enough to be at the right place at the right time, and they needed someone, and I was there. So, anyway, but I caught a ferry over to London to see Gary at the end of his recital at Wigmore Hall, which was bloody marvellous. I went up to him and asked him if I could study with him, and typically of Gary, he said, write me a letter. So I went back to Holland. As I was coming into Holland, going through customs and immigration, I only had a little backpack on me, and I got pulled up at immigration and questioned as to why I was travelling with a little, day pack, basically.
Right.
And how much money do you have? Oh, $100. Where are you going? Amsterdam. How long are you going for? A couple of weeks, maybe. Right. Right. I had to work the next day.
Yeah.
Yeah, really bad. Anyway, I never did anything by the book, and I'm not terribly proud of it. But anyway, that's the way it worked. So anyway, cut a long story short, I wrote Gary a letter. And he wrote back, typically of Gary, saying, I hope your decision is the right one for you. And so I went to the States and studied with him. And it's worth relating this experience. When I got to immigration in the States, I didn't have enough money. I mean, you needed quite a lot of money to go to college, and I didn't have anything really. So I had this long interview with a guy saying, well, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm a bass player. I'm trying to study. And he said, well, are you a good bass player or a bad bass player? And I said, well, I'm trying to be a good bass player. That's why I'm coming. He said, well, I hope so, because we sure need them.
Really? Oh, that's awesome.
And I got let in on a voluntary departure visa, which meant that even though I didn't have enough money, as long as I agreed to be out by a certain time, it wouldn't prejudice me coming in again. So it was just luck, just unbelievable luck. And then I went to, I spent one semester with Gary, and then ran out of money, had to go home, and the usual story.
But you met your wife at some point in this process.
I met my wife there, and then it came back about 18 months later, and did another 2 years with him.
Wow. When did you end up studying in New York? Was that directly after, or
no.
Okay?
After studying, Judy and I came back to Australia for a holiday. I wanted her to meet the family, and we weren't married at that point, but we were pretty hot and heavy. And I met. Luck plays a big part in my story, but I had worked with the Sydney Symphony before that for some time, and I went to see them and just chatting to some people, and there was a guy called David Potts, who's a legendary member of the SSO, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm planning to go to Norway and study a bit more." And he said, "Well, what about the principal job in Perth? I haven't heard that hasn't gone yet." So I thought, okay. So I wrote them a letter. That was on a Tuesday. On a Thursday, I got a call from them saying, "Can you be in Perth tomorrow to do an audition?" I said, "No." They said, "Well, can you do an audition at the ABC studios?" So I went to the studios. They sent me some excerpts, and went the next day and did the audition and got the job.
Wow.
So I ended up with the principal job in Perth. But in negotiating the starting time, I said, "Well, look, I've planned to go and study in Norway for 6 months. Can I start at the beginning of next year?" And the response, "Well, that's no bloody use to us." So I started, but I didn't have studying out of my system. So I left after a year, and Judy and I went to Norway for 6 months, which was great. And so I studied with Knut Gutler, which was great. Knut was a remarkable man. But anyway, then we went back to the States after that, and I sort of ended up studying with Levinson for 2 years at Juilliard, which was great also. Sure. But the strange part of that is I've got 2 postgraduate diplomas, but I don't have any undergraduate anything.
Isn't it funny how that worked?
I told you, I never did anything by the book. So we were in New York for a couple of years, and we were freelancing, and I was studying, and Judy was working a lot more than I was. But then she got pregnant, and I got this weird male thing of wanting to support my family. And so I started applying for jobs everywhere, and there was an audition for the Opera and Ballet Orchestra here, who had also played with quite a bit as associate principal. So before that, the EMSO had advertised for a principal job, so I applied for that. But then Orchestra Victoria advertised for their job. I applied for that. That audition came up first, so I did it. I got it. Signed a contract. Then the MSO audition came up. I did that. Got it. But they weren't willing to wait out my contract with OV, so I came anyway. And then later the audition came up for the MSO, and I got it again. So yeah, and I've been here ever since.
This episode is brought to you by the A440 Violin Shop. It's located just down the street from Wrigley Field in beautiful Chicago on the north side, just off the Brown Line. I have been going there my entire adult life, and they have been fantastic, both for repairs. I've had cracks repaired. I've had seams glued. I've had all sorts of students go to A440 to get instruments, to get bows. They're available with a smile, do wonderful work, and definitely check them out if you are in the Midwest. A440violinshop.com, and thanks for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Bass Violin Shop, which opened in 2001 as a small double bass workshop in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today, they're staffed by 3 full-time, highly skilled bass luthiers, and they specialize in double bass sales, rentals, setup, restoration, and repair. For nearly 20 years, they have satisfied thousands of clients by offering quality instruments, knowledgeable service, reliable repairs, and superior restorations at affordable prices. They offer the most popular brands of strings, pickups, rosins, and covers used by professionals around the world. Choose from brands such as Parastro, Acoustic Image, Tomastic, Rubner, Corelli, Colstein, Fishman, and more. Call or visit the shop in Greensboro to pick up the items in your shopping list. For more information and current inventory, visit their website at bassviolinshop.com and be sure to follow them on Facebook and Instagram.
I've said it a million times. You're making something by hand out of wood. You can do everything right, and it can still go sideways.
That's Eric Roy of Upton Bass talking about their concept of no B stock. And though it's painful to work a piece of wood for days and discover some flaw, the right call, and this is what Upton does every time, is to just get rid of that wood and start new. You never know what's going on under the surface. Despite your best efforts, wood is an organic thing, and Upton takes its commitment to quality seriously. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Yeah, that's it's funny. I love people think, you know, like young music students I've taught, their parents, they see this kind of neat and tidy progression, but your story is so much more common than people realize. I'd say 85% of the people I've chatted with, it's like, how'd you end up being in the Chicago Symphony or the Melbourne Symphony or the New York Philharmonic, whatever? It's like total randomness, no plan, here I am. So I think it's really, it's good to know, though it might not be, you know, that might be not a heartening thing to hear as a parent if someone's headed to university. I think that's so often the case for musicians.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, and I also believe, I mean, you can get metaphysical about it, but there sometimes there may not be a plan, but you end up in the right place for you.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly that if you don't get a job that you apply for, it's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the jobs I applied for and didn't get, I'm really glad now because they wouldn't have been the right place. And in the end, the places I've been have been the right ones for me at the time.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
and it looks so much neater when you look back, even if it is checkered. It's like, oh, of course, this is my person. So like in the moment, it can be hard. You don't get that audition. You think, this is my plan, and it's thwarted. But that's a great way to look at it. Actually.
Yeah. Well, because you get so stressed when you don't get a job, and the chances of getting any job are so, particularly now, so low. Right. But there's actually a place for everybody, and if you look in retrospect, you can see that there's a logic in all of that, and there are lessons to be learned from all of it. And it just sort of works out somehow the way it should have.
Yeah, I think that there's a place for everybody. That's a great thing to kind of think about and focus on, especially like a younger player or anybody who's like taking auditions, and then you see all these people, and I would think like, where are all these people going to end up? What's going to happen to them? But if I look back 10, 20, 25 years, you know, in my case, people did end up places and most of the people that I was in music school with have thriving careers now, even though it seemed maybe hopeless, you know, at the outset.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ones who don't go into orchestras and who still end up as professional musicians have the most extraordinary careers. You know, amazing stuff. And if they don't end up as professional musicians, they end up doing amazing things in other ways and still loving music. So, you know, there is a retrospective method to the madness.
So I was subbing in the San Francisco Symphony a couple weeks ago. Scott Pingle's the principal bass there, and I was just sort of thinking, and he and I have chatted a bit about it, and I've chatted with a lot of other people who've been principals, whether for a few years or decades, because the funky art of being a principal player, there's so much in that, what's probably a small percentage of people listening to this are about to become principal players, but like if you were going to have a chat with somebody who just got a principal job, like what is that role? It's a huge question.
Look, it's a huge question, but if you there are several ways to look at it, and each personality is different, and blah 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 blah. For me, it's about service. The orchestra is an enormous organism. Everybody who gets a job is probably overqualified for the job they get. Orchestra jobs are really, really hard to get. But particularly for people coming into an orchestra for the first time, it's not about glory. I had a really salient lesson in the prestige and power of being a principal bass. Very early on, we were doing a concert in Geelong, which is about 60, 70 miles from Melbourne. And there was a terrible Australian piece on the program, but the only interesting thing in it was an 8-bar bass solo, which I obviously did. Now, before the concert, I went to a cafe and had a bite to eat, and I saw a woman there, and I thought to myself, bet she's coming to the concert. And sure enough, there she was, sitting 3 rows directly in front of me. Now, in the concert, I got to stand up for the solo because, like I said, it was the only interesting thing in the piece. And anyway, I was packing up, and I'm always slow. And there was a woman who'd done a pre-concert talk who I knew. And she said, she was there when I was packing up, and she said, "Oh, are you coming to the party?" I said, "What party?" "The after-concert party." I said, "Oh, okay. Sure, why not?" So I followed her there. And it was held at the house of a guy who was basically responsible for organising the concerts for the orchestra in that town. So, he was a very strong supporter of the orchestra. So I knocked on the door. I'm still wearing my black and white. And he said, "Hello, how are you? Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm in the orchestra." So, "Oh, do come in. So I met probably 10 people at the party. Not one of them realised that I was in the orchestra, including the woman who I'd seen at the cafe, who I'd seen 3 rows back, looking at me directly as I'm taking my solo bow. Not one of them realised that I was in the orchestra. That's the glory of being a principal.
That's incredible. And playing a solo, the one interesting thing, and getting a standing, recognition.
But, look, there are so many more examples I can give you. We did a tour to Japan, and a bunch of politicians came along because they knew that music's good for business, and fine. There was a reception after one of the concerts, and there was a guy who was the treasurer of Victoria. And he started talking to me. It was like, okay. And he said, "Oh, you must love playing that instrument." And I thought, shit, he noticed I've got a nice bass. That's amazing. And I said, "Yeah, I'm, very privileged to have it." Anyway, went on. Turns out he thought I was the concert master who was playing a Strad. This guy, my hair, it's grey now, but it was brown. I was bald. He had a full head of sort of sandy-coloured hair. I had a beard. He didn't have a beard. That's the glory. We did another concert in Russia, and there were a bunch of hangers-on who came with the orchestra, friends of the orchestra. And so there was a little reception after this concert in the Smolny Cathedral. And I went there, and one of the guys said, "Oh, so, what brought you here?" I said, well, and again, I'm wearing my concert clothes, right? So actually, I'm in the orchestra. So, oh, yes, of course. Sorry. What do you play? No, don't tell me. Saxophone.
There we go. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So getting back to it, the glory of being a principal. Yeah. It's actually about trying to create the environment that has the most positive effect for the body as a whole. You know, it's a collaborative art, and our job is to play together. And so I saw my job as trying to create an environment where everybody was able to do that, and trying to make sure that everybody feels valued in that, which is a really difficult job, because as an orchestra member, you don't feel valued.
Right.
You know, it's such a weird profession, because as a member of an orchestra, you feel like part of an amorphous mass. And when there's applause, it's not for us. You know, it'll be for a conductor or a soloist or whatever. But the orchestra is kind of incidental to it, or it feels that way. What we don't actually realize is that we're enhancing people's lives as we do it. And that's the important part, that we actually get to change people's lives for the better. So that's not a very clear answer to your question.
It's a great answer. And I love that you just reminded me of moments in my life when I've had where it all gets put in perspective. I was auditioning for the Milwaukee Symphony, Wisconsin, which is a great orchestra. Actually, Andy Ricidi used to play in Sydney as one of the title players there. Anyway, it was one of my many unsuccessful auditions. So it was like my playing time was 10 a.m. Didn't get anywhere. Head straight to the bar across the street. With all the other bass players. So the bassists were drowning our sorrows at 11 a.m. And we're talking to the bartender, and you can see the hall. There's a big banner that says Milwaukee Symphony on it. And she's like, what are you in town for? Oh, we're auditioning for the Milwaukee Symphony. She said, what's that? Like, wow, we've all spent thousands of dollars to fly to this one thing. She's working across from the play. And I remember also talking to my teacher who's in the Chicago Symphony. This is back when I was 18, 19. And I was talking about, I said, the Chicago Symphony, they must be such classy folk, those musicians. And he just started laughing. Because it's such a more blue collar profession than I initially thought. I remember playing a Rosencavalier with the Lyric Opera, and we were on our second intermission. It's like 11:30 p.m. and I'm like drinking a cup of coffee at 11:30. I thought, like, wow, this is not what I expected.
Hi, my name is Andres Martin. I'm an Argentinian composer and double bass player living in Tijuana, Mexico. I play in a professional orchestra, also teaching and performing as a soloist in festivals around the world. After trying almost every string set in the market for the last 20 years, I found Kaplan String to be the only ones that can allow me to use all the different colors and techniques I've been working at during my entire career. I use both solo and orchestral sets, and I love the tone, tension, thickness, and the wide range of dynamics and harmonic resonance and timbre I can get with them. For me, they have the perfect balance between thickness and flexibility, making them a true pleasure under my fingers and bow. I'm happy that finally I have a set that makes me happy when I have to play in any situation.
Buying a double bass is a challenge for sure, and it's not getting any easier. That's why it's so great that Colstein's is offering interest-free financing on select instruments, bows, and instrument repair purchases. Learn more at Colstein.com, and while you're there, check out their wonderful selection of pedigree instruments and bows and everything else that they have to offer. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass. And you know, there's a lot that goes into being a bass player beyond that initial purchase of a bass. We need bass bows, we need bass covers, we need stands, we need new strings, pickups, wheels, quivers, upgraded gear like tuning machines, end pins, repair parts, all of that. And when someone's looking for some new bass gear or to upgrade something on their bass, I send them to Steve's shop. He's located just south of San Francisco in the Bay Area, and he is the largest dealer in basses between Los Angeles and Canada. That is a big distance, folks. Learn more at steveswanstringbass.com. And thank you so much, Steve, for sponsoring the podcast.
No. Look, it's a really difficult job. And the thing is that once, as I said, you've got to be overqualified to get in. So you've got all these great players who've worked so damn hard to get in. And then the moment they get into the orchestra, they have to subjugate everything they think about to a larger entity. And it's that loss of the vision affects a lot of people really, really badly, and it's really hard. And in the MSO, the average length of service of the musicians is 20 years. The average length of service of management is 3. Right? And yet, they're the ones that govern our lives, absolutely. So, far from being, it's a prestigious profession in the eyes of everybody who doesn't know it, but it's the most regulated feudal system. Everybody is subjugated by somebody else, and you've got the principals who are, town councillors.
Sure.
And, the concert master who's the sheriff.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
And the conductor, whichever conductor it is the duke. And we have no autonomy. No matter what brilliant musical ideas I have, if it don't fit with everybody else, it's actually in the way of the music. So we have to be prepared to subjugate everything we believe in for a greater good. They don't tell you that in music school. It's really hard. And, you do this for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And it's really hard to maintain the attitude of excellence and wanting to do it for, what you're doing it for. And I think most people who get into it don't actually understand that before they do.
It seems like, and chatting with people at any level of professional orchestra, It seems like a lot of people, to keep creatively inspired, the side project becomes so important to them.
Yeah.
I remember my former teacher in the Chicago Symphony, that was one thing he told me early on. He said, just about everybody has, whether it's playing a recital or playing in a chamber group, or even something that's creative but outside of music, like one of the San Francisco Symphony bassists does non-comedic improvisation.
Yeah.
Which is what, having some sort of creative outlet that's outside of that. Because if you're being creative, that's kind of a liability in that.
Well, you've got to channel your creativity in that works with a group, that works with a larger group, that works with an even larger group. And the other thing that people need to know is that nobody ever thanks you for doing a good job. The number of times anyone's actually said thank you to me, I could count on a hand. You get told when it's not good enough, or when you do something that people don't like, but you've got to be so self-referenced. And I've had a wonderful career, and it's a great job, and I still love music, and I still love the bass. But you need to understand that you've got to be self-referenced but not self-focused.
Yeah. It's the highs and lows, the artistic highs and lows in any orchestral job I know are pretty extreme.
Yeah.
And you could be play whatever piece, Mahler 6 or whatever piece you choose, and then the next week you're doing something that's just completely silly.
Yeah, I mean, the lows get pretty low.
Yeah.
In my case, it was Meatloaf.
Okay.
That, I think, was probably pretty close to the worst gig we've done.
That's awesome. I can see that being...
But some of the highs have been amazing. You get to play with extraordinary people. in extraordinary situations. And yes.
I got a question for, and again, anybody who's done the position like what you've done for so many years. We talked about advice to someone who's about to become a principal. Let's pretend that there are a whole bunch of conductors listening to this. Advice from someone with a title chair and experience on, let's say, it could be any conductor, young conductors, guest conductors, someone coming to work with an orchestra. What's a good approach to take? What's a good way to cheese off the musicians?
Well, the first approach I would say is, before you start the first rehearsal, pull the stick out. And I don't mean the baton.
I love the Australian. That's a good.
In my experience, there are a couple of types of great conductors, and they're incredibly rare. But there's basically there are some great conductors who are incredibly directive, and they want every note to be a particular way, and you know, they manage to grind what they want out of an orchestra, and sometimes it can be amazing. The vast majority of great conductors say, "This is my framework, you do it." The more they talk, the worse it is. The more they talk, generally, the worse it gets. Usually, with a professional orchestra, the first run-through is about as good as it's going to get. All we need is for them to show us what they want. If they have to blather on about it, chances are they're not that great. And then there are other good conductors who just get out of the way and say, "You're the musicians, you do it." Because there are very few conductors who are actually as musical as the people they're conducting. And there was a really good example of this. We did I think it wasn't a particularly serious concert, but it was the last concert of one of the cellists, who was a grumpy old thing. She'd hated the job, and she was sick of it. She was sick of the job when I joined, and she was there another 15 years. And so anyway, got to the last concert, and the conductor, who was reasonable mid-range conductor, and there was an encore, and he stood her up, and we were going to do the encore, which was a light something or other, and he said, "You conduct it," and she did. And you know what? This is a woman who'd never conducted in her life, and it wasn't a difficult thing to conduct, but it sounded better than when the conductor had done it, because she was more musical, and she had a musicality that came through. I'll never forget that. Never ever forget it.
Well, it's such a different perspective, spending time in the orchestra, and that's why I think a lot of the best conductors, not maybe 100% of them, but so many of them came from that world.
Well, the other thing that I'm going to say, which, well, certainly a lot of other people wouldn't like, but probably string players will relate to it. Most of the best conductors that we've had have been string players. There is a difference. I don't know why, but it's just the truth.
Yeah. Well, as a fellow string player, I can see it. So if Meatloaf was the low point.
Oh, God.
And I'm sure there have been others. But there have probably been a lot of experiences. Any favorite?
Look, there was a Russian conductor, a guy called Temirkanov, who came for one concert. We played in a festival in Brisbane with him. And he, first of all, he couldn't really speak English. Secondly, he'd smoked himself half to death, so he could barely talk. So we did Rack 2, played the Dvorak Cello Concerto with Lynn Harrell, which was just insane, and the Ruslan and Ludmilla. Now, this is probably at least 20 years ago, and I still remember it, so it's saying something. And we ran through it, and he stopped at one point and said, "Make music, make music." And that was pretty much all he said for the whole rehearsal. We did the concert. It was stunning.
Wow.
Stunning. It still gives me goosebumps. Yeah. Amazing high.
And not a lot of words.
Yeah, well, but that was so instructive because you got all of these other guys who, try and do so. This guy just showed what he wanted. And we didn't need to talk about it. We just did it. Fantastic concert. Just fabulous. There were some really fun things. Got to play with Ray Charles. That was amazing. We toured with Kiss. That was...
yeah, what was that like?
It was a trip.
I'll bet.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, so we've had some great experiences along the way.
Well, I like the way you looked at the 30 years of the orchestra. And probably now you got another, hopefully.
Yeah,
30. Another.
I'm counting on at least another 30 years.
Yeah. Well, we gotta. I can't wait to see what you do with that time, and maybe. Well, I'm saying right now I got to come back next year and bring my wife because she's very annoyed that I'm here without her. So maybe we could do a round 2 and see what you are up to.
Absolutely.
Maybe we can wrap up with my. I don't ever have any typical questions except one. So go back and talk to young Steve. Give him some advice. You could pick the age.
God, that's a really good question. Probably this is going to be a little bit convoluted, but stop spending so much time wondering about whether you can do something or not, and just do it. Just go for it and give it everything you got, and don't worry about whether you can or not.
Yeah, it's kind of like, didn't Yoda have a phrase like that? Do or not do, there is no try. Is that Yoda or is that...
yeah, it sounds Yoda-esque.
we'll attribute it to you. Steve, pleasure. Can't wait to spend some time with you tomorrow, too.
Fantastic.
Great
Thanks,
to
Jason.
meet you in person.
Yeah, likewise.
Steve, thank you so much for chatting. I had such a great time, and let's do a round 2 for sure. Can't wait to hear about what you're up to next. And today's chat and all the conversations you're hearing these next few weeks or months really come from my late 2019 trip to Australia, which coincided with the Melbourne-based day where Steve played at. I also got a chance to meet all sorts of folks at Ben Puglisi's soiree at his bass shop, and I did a write-up about this whole trip. You can find it on my blog. I'll link up to it in this episode as well. But this is the sort of thing I would love to do more of with the podcast. Go and really get in depth, spend some time with folks like I did here in Australia, like I did in late 2018 in New York City. I'd say once a year if I can carve out a couple of weeks like with this Australia trip and just go and immerse myself in a different place, a different culture, a different set of players. I just got so much out of this trip, and I really hope you're enjoying following along on the journey with me. If you're new or you're old or you haven't reached out before, even if you have, you can contact me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. And I love hearing from people, where you're from, what you enjoy about the podcast, who you'd love to hear from on the podcast. That's just so helpful and insightful. And it just makes me remember there are people listening on the other end. It's not just me talking into a microphone in my San Francisco place. So thank you if you have reached out, and I'd love to hear from you. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And Mitch makes beautiful basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. And thank you to Krista Copper for cataloging and archiving everything we talk about here on the podcast. So helpful for so many reasons as we continue to move this crazy adventure that this podcast is forward. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.